Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event, which we are calling Striving for a Resilient Future, addressing key asks of the vulnerable countries. We have a very stellar panel here who I'll introduce in a few minutes and invite to share some thoughts on where do we go from here. But to lay the framing of what we want to do here today, this afternoon, let me just first introduce myself. My name is Salimul Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and I am part of what we are calling the ACT 2025 Alliance, a group of northern and southern think tanks who have come together to chart the path not just to COP27, but COP28, and then COP29, and then COP30 over the next 5 years, and do it in a strategic manner with a very, very strong interest in promoting the needs of the most vulnerable people on the planet and the most vulnerable countries on the planet as well. And so we have a very normative approach to what we want to achieve. It's not just observe things, but to make things happen. And it's been 6 months or more, in fact, since we met in November in COP26, less than 6 months to go to COP27. So a very good point in time to take stock of what's happened and to plan for the next few months. In terms of what's happened, I'll highlight a few things in particular. Firstly, since COP26, we had the IPCC Working Group 2 Sixth Assessment Report come out, and then Working Group 3, which again reiterated the impacts of climate change are now happening at significant scales around the world, attributable to the fact that human-induced climate change is already a reality. Global temperatures have gone up above 1 degree, and we are seeing that happen. In fact, every single day something happens. In my part of the world, in Bangladesh, we just had some floods. In our next-door neighbor in India and Pakistan, they had a heat wave well over 50 degrees. Birds died in the air and fell down to the ground. It was so hot. They're having a drought in Eastern Africa right now as we speak. So every day, somewhere in the world, we are seeing impacts of human-induced climate change that are leading to significant losses and damages to people, livelihoods, and indeed lives as well. So the reality of climate change is now something that already exists. We have entered what I call the era of loss and damage from climate change, and that era is going to continue for quite a long time to come, and we better get used to it. On the other hand, we are hopefully going to make progress on achieving our long-term temperature goal of 1.5 degrees, reaching the $500 billion over 5 years climate finance goal, and looking to develop a new climate finance for loss and damage in particular. As you know, we wanted a facility to be declared in Glasgow. We didn't get a facility, but we got a dialogue. The dialogue has started. We've had 2 sessions already, and we have another session coming up tomorrow. Hopefully that dialogue will continue and be fruitful and not just talk for another 3 years. Let me very quickly introduce our distinguished panelists, and then I'll give the floor to each of them to share some thoughts with the first round of questions from me, and then we hope to open it up to questions from the audience. We want to make this as interactive as possible and have conversations with each of you. So I'll start with the far end of the table. We have Sarah Ahmed, who is an advisor to the Vulnerable 20 group of finance ministers. There's actually 55 finance ministers in the Climate Vulnerable Forum group now. It started with 20 and was called V20 at the time. Then we have Christopher Bartlett, who is the Climate Diplomacy Manager, Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the government of Vanuatu. As you know, Vanuatu is going to go to the General Assembly to get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on loss and damage, a very brave move by Vanuatu that we all support. Then we have Chuks, I'm going to call him Chuks as we all know him, who is the director of the Center for Climate Change and Development at the Alex Ekwuemo Federal University in Nigeria. And then we have Fatuma Hussain, who is the SBI coordinator for the Africa Group of Negotiators on Climate Change. And last but not least, Preeti Bhandari, who is the Senior Advisor, Global Climate Program and Finance Center of the World Resource Center based in Washington, D.C. So let me just share a little bit about what this Act 2025 consortium or alliance that we call ourselves is hoping to achieve. Firstly, what we are hoping to push forward is that the significant progress on reaching the 1.5 degrees. We are hearing now more and more voices saying that it may not be achievable. We believe it's still achievable given the political will to generate the activities that are needed to reduce the emissions gap. And we need countries to step up with ambition, and we hope that will happen in COP27. Second thing we need to see happen is the delivery of the climate finance that was promised. $100 billion a year was promised from 2020 onwards. It didn't happen in 2020. It didn't happen in 2021. I'm not sure it'll happen even in 2022, but over 5 years, we want to see $500 billion on mitigation and adaptation alone. That was what was promised before. We are also looking to get new finance to address loss and damage, which is now happening in reality on the ground. And as I said, we have the global dialogues, the Glasgow dialogues on loss and damage to take forward there. And then finally, holding all countries to account to deliver on what they promise. Too often we have seen these meetings result in promises. The most significant one, which was a good one, was the Paris Agreement. But then our leaders all went home and they didn't actually fulfill those promises. So we need to be moving from words to action, from agreements to delivery. And in that delivery space and implementation space, we need to be bringing in all the different actors who have a role to play, from the private sector to mayors of cities, to citizens, to NGOs, to youth, young people, women's groups. We all have a role to play, and we all need to be working together to move things in the right direction to tackle the problem. The problem is a crisis, an emergency. We need all hands on deck to do that, and we need this process to support that kind of immediacy of action. Unfortunately, the Glasgow Climate Pact did not do that. You may recall that in Glasgow, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who was the chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, demanded when she attended the leaders' meeting in the beginning of the COP that the outcome of the Glasgow Pact be called the Glasgow Emergency Climate Pact. In the end, the COP26 presidency had a Glasgow Pact. They called it the Glasgow Climate Pact. The word emergency did not appear in the name, and the feeling of emergency did not appear in the results of Glasgow. We need to correct that. We need Sharm el-Sheikh to treat it as a true emergency and to rise to the occasion in making sure that we do that. So that is the hope that we have of the process going forward. We are not too cynical. We are disappointed with results, but we don't give up. We want to push the negotiating process to achieve the results that we hope that they'll be able to do. And from our side, as outsiders, we are very happy to engage in the process. We do a lot of research. We've just published a number of articles or chapters on the global goal on adaptation, which Jux has been leading on loss and damage, which my center has been leading on. These will be available on our website for you, and we have a few publications here as well that you might want to pick up as you go out, before you go out of the room. And we'll be producing more as we go along over the coming months and years. So please do keep an eye on our website to track our research outputs in particular. So let me now invite the first member of our panel, Fatuma Hussain, who will have to leave us a little shortly because she has to go and attend the negotiations. Fatima, would you like to just share with us, in particular, since you follow the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage and the demand for finance for loss and damage, where you feel we stand on that at the moment, and what you think we might expect from We've had 2 sessions already. We have another session coming up tomorrow. What do you hope to get out of tomorrow's session and coming out of Bonn?
Thank you very much, Dr. Salim, and good afternoon, everyone. So on the Glasgow dialogue, in particular, from where we stand as the AGN, as the Africa group, we had really insisted that that's an issue of utmost priority. The financing for loss and damage, as Dr. Salim has just said, quite an important issue. We expressed our concern around what we actually achieved in Glasgow in terms of not being able to push through with generally the facility that we really wanted. But that's where we are now. We have a dialogue with no outputs, with no link to the formal negotiations. So what we're trying to do is to push for an agenda item that really tries to put this in the negotiation itself. We tried this from the start of the meeting, really pushed for that, but unfortunately, because of different views of parties, there has to be a consensus when we want to include something in the agenda. So because there was no consensus, we have now this process of consultation to have an agenda item included either in the SBI or the COP, and that consultation is going on. So quickly moving from here, I would actually go to the SBI meeting consultation with the AGN chair to see how we can take that forward. But the dialogue itself, quite an open-ended, no clear results envisioned. It's just an issue of trying to understand from my recollection of what happened at the last meeting. I think it's just an issue of all the partners who are involved in humanitarian affairs, other financing of developing countries, to just tell us what they do, which is not really the essence of what we're trying to achieve. But in broad terms, I just wanted to indicate that from where we stand, quite aligning to the key priorities you have indicated. But coming to here, Bonn, and moving to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is quite an important COP for the Africa group, looking at it as an implementation COP. We want to see progress on all the elements, and basically of importance to us will be adaptation, means of implementation, and loss and damage. Those are quite critical for us. When it comes to particularly what we have at least discussed here and made progress on, trying to understand the science and what the IPCC is telling us from the Working Group 2 report, Working Group 3 report. Working Group 2 actually talks about the special situation of Africa, and it's been difficult for us to land that discussion, at least knowing that we haven't been able to successfully achieve that in Paris. In the context of Paris Agreement, ensure that Africa's special circumstances is quite recognized. And considering what the science is telling us, and recollecting the political discussion here in the negotiations, and what the science is telling us has been an important consideration for us. We've been pushing for adaptation. Adaptation, the global goal on adaptation is quite an important issue for us. We've managed, at least in this meeting, to have it in the agenda. It wasn't there initially, as you might recall. And we're having both the workshop as well as the formal discussion. I think loss and damage I've talked about. We also having the technical dialogue under the GST, the Global Stocktech, which is a ratcheting ambition mechanism, where we're looking at where we are in terms of the collection of the NDCs and what we've been able to achieve against the 1.5 goal, and see what we can do. And as you can imagine, we have a packed agenda to really make progress in the technical dialogue under the GST. We've started very well on the work program on mitigation. At least we have some text which really acknowledges where we are, and we're trying to elaborate on what we need to do under that work program. I would stop there unless I think you would want me to reflect on anything else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatuma, for that comprehensive response. I know you may have to leave in a few minutes, but if you have time to stay and listen and maybe even take another question later on. Let me now move on to Sarah Ahmed, picking up on the conversation about finance for loss and damage in particular. You have been advising the finance ministers of the Climate Vulnerable Forum who call themselves the V20, but as I said, there are 55 finance ministers in the group. And they have their own multi-donor fund that they had created with money from the vulnerable countries themselves some years ago. And very recently, they have declared a window in the multi-donor fund for loss and damage finance in particular. Would you like to tell us a little bit about more about that and what you hope to achieve? What is it that you're doing, and then what do you hope to achieve? Yep. Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Salim. So the V20, the Vulnerable Group of 20 Ministers of Finance, mandated and announced a dedicated new funding program called the Loss and Damage Funding Program. And this was during the April 2020 V20 Ministerial Dialogue that happened in the spring meetings this year in the World Bank and IMF meetings. The intention of this funding program, with thanks to the fund, as well as philanthropic contributions from the Children's Investment Family Foundation, as well as the Open Societies Foundation. The intention is to show, in practical terms, what a fund or what a delivery could look like to reach the most vulnerable communities. More often than not, climate vulnerable countries and perspectives are left out when funds are being designed or mechanisms are being designed. And so the intention of the V20 here is to be part of the solution, because I think this is a key part to the progress of the Paris Agreement and everything we've seen so far. The climate vulnerable countries are at the driver's seat, are partners in this process. And so through this funding program, the V20 aspires that this will be ready before the COP and could then be a contribution to progress in terms of this is what it could look like, and this is how we can quickly deliver resources to communities. And so we're looking at the Global Environment Facility, for example. They have quite a successful small grants program and other funds across the GEF that have been a bit quicker in access. We hear access issues through and through year after year. And so how about we design something that could enable quicker access, that is forced even to act with urgency. And so this is the intention of the Loss and Damage Funding Program.
Great, thank you very much. And we wish you good luck with that, and we hope to hear some actual results by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh in November this year. Let me now move on to Christopher from Vanuatu. I mentioned that Vanuatu has taken, the Prime Minister of Vanuatu has taken a very bold step, in my opinion, to actually try and get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice through an initial debate and discussion, and we hope a successful vote in the General Assembly coming up soon. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the thinking behind that, where you are now, and what we can do to help you going forward?
Sure. Thanks very much, Salim, and good afternoon to everybody. I think you're absolutely right that Vanuatu has really stepped out with this initiative to bring climate change to the International Court of Justice. And let me be very clear that this is not a court case. This is not litigation. Vanuatu is not intent on assigning blame or seeking any kind of monetary reparations or compensations through this process. What the International Court of Justice does as the legal primary body of the United Nations is answer questions that are difficult when it comes to international law that we've all developed together. And so what Vanuatu is really trying to do is to get clarification about what international law says about protecting human rights from climate change. So there's a whole range of international laws, whether it's the human rights laws, the environmental laws, common property laws, the do no harm principles. And so we're asking the court to just give clarification to all of us about what we need to do to meet our obligations under those laws when we come to the Paris Agreement. So when we put together our nationally determined contributions, what do we need to keep in the back of our minds to make sure that we're bringing human rights people to the front of our obligations on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage? And so that's really Vanuatu's intention. Sitting in the negotiations now, I feel like there's a real disconnect with what we aspired to in Paris and what we're actually achieving here. And I'm a negotiator under loss and damage, and what I'm finding is that we're really talking across each other on this issue of loss and damage and addressing finance for loss and damage. My own personal story from Vanuatu is that when we talk about loss and damage, we're not talking about something that can be sorted out quickly and then come back to some sort of a state that we were before. I live in a community with a coral reef in front of the village, and 20 years ago, that coral reef was vibrant. I mean, that was the source of our food and our economy and our traditional identity. And the reef started to die about 15 years ago. And the village did everything that it could. We went to experts and we said, how can we save our identity? And they said, oh, don't worry, do marine protected areas, or put some fishing restrictions on the reef, or stop harvesting the sea cucumbers. And we did it all. We did everything that we could, but the reef kept dying. And then we went to the adaptation experts, and they said, oh, don't worry, start planting coral, or stop eating herbivorous fish. And we did. We planted thousands of coral fragments on the reef, but the reef kept dying. And today, that reef is dead. And what we've realized is there's no going back. Once the reef dies, it's gone. It's finished. That's the kind of loss and damage that we're talking about. So there's no insurance product that can address a dead reef. There's no humanitarian trigger that allows finance to flow for a reef that's dead. And so this is the difference, I think, that developed and developing country parties are coming at this issue of loss and damage. Now, I don't think that it's an irreparable difference. What we found is that everybody is now financing loss and damage. And in Vanuatu, it's the unsung heroes of the communities themselves. They themselves are putting money, their own money, into transforming their lives away from a fishing economy now to a completely different way of life that may depend on agriculture or livestock. That's what it means to address loss and damage. We're not looking for handouts. We're not looking for reparations or compensation. We're looking for transformation with dignity to a new way of life based on a climate that we all are now experiencing have been devastated by. And so I think what we need to do is make sure that there's a real conversation, not a blah, blah, blah that's outside the process, but a real space where we can come together and not blame each other, but come to a decision that works for everybody. And there are so many financial instruments. Vanuatu, we're putting about 15% of our budget policy to addressing climate change. That's the same that we spend on education. That's the same that we're spending on health. We're putting 15% to climate change. Everybody needs to come to the table. There are debt cancellation mechanisms. There are risk clauses in debt mechanisms. I mean, we can do it. We just need now a political signal in this process that we're ready to come to the table. And I think with trust and by COP27, we can do this.
Great, thank you very much, Christopher, for sharing that. And I think one of the new dimensions in this conversation that we hope we can engender, starting here in Bonn, but taking it forward, is to change the conversation that we have had so far on loss and damage from it being seen as developing countries wanting money from developed countries. That is a wrong framing, as you quite rightly pointed out. And given the fact that climate change is now impacting everywhere, including rich countries, and I'll cite the example of the country we are in right now in Germany. You'll recall a few months before COP26 in Glasgow, they had a flash flood here. Nearly 200 people lost their lives in Germany, one of the richest countries in the world. They were not prepared for it. And I'm told that the total cost afterwards of loss and damage to Germany came to 30 billion euros. That's not an insignificant amount at all, a very significant amount of money that Germany had to pay for loss and damage from human-induced climate change. And so it's now a universal. Rich countries, Canada, America, Japan, they're all having to pay for loss and damage at home. And so are the developing countries as well, as we heard from Vanuatu. So how can we put our heads together to have collective action that helps everybody, not just one group helping another group, which is very often how it's perceived by the developed countries in particular as a demand for more money, and they don't want to give us more money. That is not a correct framing. It's about how do we deal with this problem that all of us are going to face, and we learn from each other and share our knowledge and experience with each other. So now let me change subjects and invite Chuks, who has been working in our group on the global goal on adaptation. This is another one of the key elements that we are discussing here in Bonn. The conversation has already started. We have the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh discussion program on this. We've had the initial discussion already in Bonn. We'll have a couple more going forward. Chuks has already written the Act 2025 chapter on this, so I'll invite him to share some thoughts on what is it we'd like to see coming out of this process, on the global goal on adaptation in particular.
Thank you very much, Salim. Well, you said it's a different subject, but actually they're very intimately linked. What the IPCC report tells us is that up to 3.6 billion people are already living in the context of a climate vulnerable context. And the number is likely going to increase, especially if you think about the fact that we are still way off in terms of meeting the ambitious mitigation goals that we have set for ourselves. And so making sure that we have a process, a framework, and a mechanism for ratcheting up action on adaptation is crucial going forward. And indeed, parties to the UNFCCC agreement envisaged this over 7 years ago. In the run-up to the Paris Agreement, there were two key things that were necessary, among other things. First is to have a clear goal for mitigation, which parties eventually managed to get, setting a target of under 2 degrees and going as far as 1.5 degrees if necessary. But they did not manage to get a goal on adaptation, even though that was negotiated and pushed, and Fatima has left, by African group and as well as many other vulnerable countries. But what Paris did say was to set that this goal was necessary. It was necessary for a range of reasons. Number one, to raise the profile of adaptation. Adaptation is very crucial. UNFCCC recognizes adaptation as being on equal pedestal, equal standing with mitigation rhetorically, but in practice, emphasis have tended to be more on mitigation and adaptation. You heard Fatima saying that they had to fight to bring the global goal on adaptation into the agenda for this particular intercession. So although there is a rhetorical mental recognition that these two things are on equal pedestal, emphasis have tended to become to be devoted to mitigation for some reasons that we can discuss in the Q&A if you want to. But the challenge was that we didn't have a goal to kind of drive effort. And so the Paris Agreement recognized that this kind of goal was necessary. But after that, little or nothing was done about it for a very long time. The good news is now that in Glasgow last year, a new program, the Sharm el-Sheikh and Glasgow program, to begin discussion on the global goal has been established. What we are calling for, the vulnerable group, the Act 25 are calling for, we are saying, yes, this is a good step. We appreciate it, but it's not sufficient. We want, of course, I'm going to be participating in the global stock take as well. So I'm not making light of it. And some interesting developments have been made and progress have been made in the context of work programs within the UNFCCC in the past. However, we think that this is such an important point that have to not only be taken in the context of the work group that have been set up, but that a rigorous intellectual scientific process needs to go into getting the global goal. And one of our calls, therefore, is that the IPCC need to be involved in a much more systematic way. Indeed, we think there is a strong case to be made for a special IPCC report on the global goal on adaptation to help us with the cost, with assessment of vulnerability, with metrics for measuring global goal. There is a precedence for this. The IPCC played a vital role in elaborating the metrics for the greenhouse emission inventory. At a point many years ago, people thought it can never be done. You can use 1,001 different metrics. The work of the IPCC went a long way in helping to provide a standard through which this can be done. And otherwise, we won't be talking much in a reasonable way about even the global goal of mitigation. We need to follow the same process on adaptation. Let there be an IPCC special report to help with the elaboration of the metrics that will give urgency and give academic and intellectual rigor to setting this goal. But we also have a second important point that we are making in the context of the global goal. All too often, because developing countries are not effectively represented in rooms where important decisions are made, it's also possible to have a goal that is not very sensitive to the needs of vulnerable countries. We see this in, for example, the CDM, where certain rules were made, and it didn't quite favor developing countries in terms of access, and they had to jump through different hoops, bureaucratic hoops, in order to get money. And then some of the projects were actually implemented in the pursuit of the CDM ended up not addressing or supporting or facilitating sustainable development or even mitigation in some instances. So we are cautioning against a top-down approach to the global goal that fails to recognize the diversity and the unique circumstances of developing countries. For example, a goal that kind of is straitjacket in the way that it measures cost, vulnerability, and access to finance. All of those things should be avoided. So those are the two key points that we're making in context of the global goal. It is an important thing to be highlighted in the agenda. People say, well, adaptation is kind of all local. There's no way you can have a goal. Well, let's try and see what the IPCC come up with. Because in my view, I think it is not an insurmountable problem. When the will is there and you unleash the power of science, we can get something that can help to galvanize action. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that excellent overview and advice on how we take this forward. I'll now turn to Preeti and ask you a little bit about how do we take things forward? And given your experience now in WRI, but before that in the UNFCCC Secretariat itself, and then with the Development Bank, the ADB, you have a wide spectrum of experiences that can be brought to bear in terms of how we as a consortium can genuinely, supportively influence and support the process of taking things forward and not just talking forever about doing things but never doing them enough.
That's a tall order, Salim, but...
you can answer it.
No, I basically want to make 3 points, but I wanted to say that, the key word that has come through in all the interventions is political will. It's Christopher, Fatima, and Chuck's, and you, of course, all talked about it. When there was the political will, we got the Paris Agreement. When there was the political will, we got the Green Climate Fund. And all the contention that we are seeing at the moment is probably due to lack of political will. So what can we do to create that
political will and what we as a consortium, bring to the table as non-negotiators, non-partisan parties who can bring science to the table, who can bring, life experiences like Christopher talked about, or what Sarah talked about, willing to provide a prototype on how things can be delivered. So it's a question of political will and how we as a consortium and we with partners in the global north can help create that momentum, I think is important. And within that construct, highlighting the principles of solidarity, rebuilding the trust that has been lost, I think is critically important, because after all, Paris Agreement was a compact. There was a give and take that took place. So we have to hold that compact to light and ensure that it is implemented and, again, get that political will going. And I liked, what you said, that it's not about transfers of money or transfers of wealth. If it is being seen like that, then we will never come to a solution. So it is that whole question and construct of solidarity that has to be brought up. And the civil society, the think tanks have an important role to play. And I'm not saying that the negotiators don't have the will. The negotiators have a role to play, but it is the political masters who will do the deal making, if I may say so. So for me, that is most important. And we have to bring to light all the examples of where it has been done in the climate space or otherwise. Yeah. The second is about financing, and again, this is well known. It has come in the context of climate finance also. The scale. I mean, 100 billion was a number all said and done, which did not match the needs, but it was a compromise. And again, it was in good faith and trust that developing countries agreed to that. But we know where we are with the 100 billion. So that apart, what is the scale? If we are talking about meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, then the scale that is required to meet that goal is significantly higher, significantly higher. We have all sorts of assessments and numbers on, what the damages could be like. It could be about 600 billion in 2030 or 1.7 up to 1.7 trillion in 2050. These are big numbers, and you can go to whatever granularity to contest those numbers, but it is telling you the kind of scale that we're talking about. It is about access. Both Sarah talked about access, looking at how access can be made easy. And it is not about being reactive, providing reactive finance like humanitarian assistance is, which is not to take away from the importance of humanitarian assistance. But that is reactive. What we need is anticipatory financing. Anticipatory financing so that, the livelihoods of your community, Christopher, are not lost, or they do not have to transition to something which they don't know, which is a completely different way of life. So scale, accessibility, predictability, and so that different financing streams are not conflated. We do all recognize that we are living in a very fiscally constrained world, be it developing countries or developed countries. But if we bring more faith into each other's points of view and listen to each other, rather than really talk to each other and understand the context. It is not about you getting richer and me getting poorer. It is about actually the survival, and you talked about it. It is the emergency that we are in. So if those kind of principles are kind of agreed to by the political masters, then I think we will see some solutions and landing zones. And in terms of sources, there is so much talk about public versus private versus innovative sources, but we have to recognize the private sector responds to what the public sector sets as the tone, as the regulation. So the primacy of public finance cannot be undermined. And it is in that context, then we see how private sector can be brought in. But there is a significant primary role of the public sector in terms of mobilization. And then we can look at different sources. I mean, those sources have been talked about in the context of the climate finance debate also, be it air travel levy, be it, now special drawing rights. Also, the IMF is talking about this resiliency trust fund, or it could be related to fossil fuel subsidies also, to what extent a percentage of those can be reduced to address the financing needs. And actually, it is a double win that way, that you're weaning yourself away from fossil fuels. Or it could be, as I think Christopher mentioned, in terms of debt suspensions, it could be in terms of debt swaps. So the toolbox is there. It is a question, again, of first, getting off the ground with the political will, and then, the form will follow. Yeah. In terms of mobilization, I think it has been done before in the context of climate, but in the other contexts, very, very significantly, as we know, recently with the recent events, how funding was found. So again, it comes back to the question of the willingness to take the next step towards implementation.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Preeti, and thank you to all our panelists for some initial framing remarks. We'd now like to go into a conversation with all of you. I believe we have a microphone available. If you can raise your hand, we'll get a mic to you. Please feel free to either ask a question or make a comment or share some of your own thoughts and experiences. In particular, the question that we want to address is, how do we move things forward? So what are the lessons that we might want to use that you feel that would enable us to move things forward and not just keep talking at cross purposes, which seems to have been the pattern so far. And I do believe we are live streaming as well, so there'll be some perhaps comments or questions coming on the live stream. So Nate, you let me know if that happens. Anybody want to go first with a comment or a question? Yes, Mizan, go ahead. Here. Break the ice. No, use the microphone.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mizan Khan, Deputy Director of ICAT. So we are a part of the Act 25. Still, I have some comments and questions. We are now under Article 8 of the Paris Agreement. We had to forego the issue of liability, fine, for a compromise, something like that. But now we talk of solidarity. But if you look at the solidarity issue, where in climate change, for example, there is mutuality of interest more evident, more clear, where adaptation finance is extremely poor. And even for the LDCs, more than 2/3 comes as loans, not just grants. This is double injustice. If you look at vaccination, for example, there is almost zero solidarity, almost. So how can we promote solidarity in climate adaptation, kind of? So this is my question.
Thank you. That is the key question that we're all grappling with. And I'm going to look to the audience to give us some answers, and I'll come to the panelists a little later. Let's collect a couple of more comments or questions from the floor, and then I'll come back to the panel. Who wants to go next? Go on, feel free. Everybody seems to have had a heavy lunch. You're sort of now taking a breather or a nap now. Okay, then let me come to our side of the table and invite our panelists to do a second round of reflection on, in particular, how do we deal with these tricky issues that have bedeviled us for so long. Chooks, you want to go first?
Sure. Mizan, you've asked a very important question, which is really why we are here. Well, let me just offer some reflections on how we can provide or enhance solidarity. You could actually look at what has happened from 1992 to date as glass half full or glass half empty. The groundswell, which is a growing portfolio of individuals, organizations, and institutions working hard to push politicians and negotiators to do something, has increased in the last 5 years. One of the things that happened in Glasgow was the negotiation, of course, but also the movement by the youth pushing their countries. And this youth movement included youth from the developed and from the developing world. It gratifies my heart to see the snowballing of this kind of youth movement calling for radical action. We also see within, because Priti talked a lot about political will, and you can actually summarize the lethargy, the reluctance, the limited movement that we have had, as she rightly pointed, to just this political will issue. We have the technology, we have the money. See how much was mobilized very quickly during the COVID-19. We're talking about trillions within a very short space of time. So, and as Chris was saying, we have some examples, and Sarah as well. It can be done. But the problem is that, in a sense, this is a moral issue. And the moral issue is in some way hard to resolve. Number one, those who are suffering the impact of climate change are often very distant from, the people that, if you like, have the technology and the finance to assist. So it seems as a distant problem. Number two, the lines of causality and blame can be very confusing sometimes, not very clear. You're just driving your car from here to here. How can anyone say that you are causing death in Zambia just by trying to pick your child up from school or to go on holidays? And naturally, human beings don't like to have a sense of blame. So then we pick and choose science, and we become a bit too optimistic, right? Because we don't want to accumulate blame. So as an IPCC scholar, we spend a lot of time thinking, how do we phrase this to reflect balance? Some people say it's too negative. If it's too negative, people are going to tune off. People say, let's try and sound a more optimistic voice. And I think this is a challenge. How do you strike the balance? So I think morality, placing more emphasis on solidarity, on morality, on the things that unite us, will help. And then we really need to tackle the issue of the big C word, the issue of capitalism. Right? There is a limit to which you can actually solve this problem of climate change by just the same level of consciousness and political and economic system that caused it in the first place. And I'm not bashing capitalism at all. It's a resilient system. It's helped to engender growth. But you cannot solve this problem by just more of the same approach. We have to look at the fact that we have planetary boundaries, we have huge inequality, huge injustice, and international relations, which is one of my disciplines, have kind of proceeded from the assumption that morality and justice is not part of what we do in international relations. It's all about bargaining, it's all about power, it's all about economic interest. But things like climate change is forcing us to reassess that kind of intellectual assumption. And we need to really bring more justice and more equity into the discussions and the sort of way that we design our implementation approaches.
Great, thank you very much, Chuks, for that excellent response. Let me invite other panelists, Priti or Christopher or Sarah. Christopher, you want to take a go?
Yeah, I fully agree that the scale of the problem is scary. And I think it scares everybody. It scares us in Vanuatu because we see a very unfortunate future. It scares rich developed countries because we recognize that the money that's required is pretty significant. But I'm also amazed what we can do when we put our minds to mobilizing money. We've looked on with horror that governments have mobilized trillions of dollars towards militarization. And we in the Pacific are watching our partners come to us and talk about the need for new investments and new partnerships in security. But for us, security is climate security. It's human rights security. It's water security and food security and shelter security. We don't want to talk about military bases in the Pacific. We want to talk about money for human rights security. We can manage to mobilize trillions. Let's do that for climate security. The COVID crisis mobilized tens of trillions around the world. We mobilized money for the COVID crisis. So there's no question that the scale of finance is manageable for climate change. I also fully agree that when we talk about global solidarity, we need to put people at the front of those narratives. Any other narrative will not work to get that political momentum that we need. We need empathy. We need a humanistic perspective. We need to get off of gigatons of carbon and degrees of Celsius, because that doesn't actually mean anything for policymakers who are going to be mobilizing money in developed and developing world. I also very much agree that in the past, suffering was distant, but it is coming closer and closer to everybody. I guarantee that every finance minister around the world today is looking very closely at their budgets to see where they're going to have to squeeze out money to address loss and damage. Doesn't matter what corner of the world you're in, that's what finance ministers are doing. And I actually think finance ministers need to be a part of this process. We need to get the climate politics away and get right down to where you can pull the levers and the strings to get that money moving. And finally, I want to address the issue of youth and young people. Because, I mean, in Vanuatu, they're the ones that pushed us to take this initiative to the International Court of Justice. It was actually a group of law students from the University of the South Pacific that came to the government of Vanuatu for 2 years in a row and said, don't you realize that there's a pathway here for collective action? This is not a contentious pathway. This is a way that we can garner support of the entire global community. And we listened, and we watched, and we analyzed, and we realized that, yes, they're right, that this is the way forward. So yes, I hope that our young people are here, and I congratulate them, and I thank them for pushing a government to move in this direction.
Great, thank you very much. Question or make your comment.
Thank you. I'm Zoha Shao from the Stockholm Environment Institute. I wanted to say that, I fundamentally believe that loss and damage finance is compensation and reparations, not only for historical climate emissions, but also for the legacy and history of colonialism, which has left communities more vulnerable to the climate crisis to begin with. However, I feel like conversations around reparations and compensation in the negotiations can very much close off discussions and limit progress. So I guess my question is, how do you achieve that balance between ensuring justice for that historical legacy while also trying to get money flowing as fast as possible through these processes?
Great, thank you. Let's take a few questions. I see some hands cropping up now. I'll ask the panelists to keep notes and respond later.
Hello?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Dallas Conyers. It's a thought kind of question. One of the things I've been tangling with, and especially with vulnerable countries, is they have a need to continue with their own development often. They're usually not as mechanized or industrialized. And so they still need to do some of the things that I'm from the US that we consider, or that people like me look at and say, that's not a good direction to go in, right? You don't want to take the path we have taken, but you can't say don't take that path, because they still have to do to care for their people. And the other side of that coin is humans favor specialization. That's how we develop. And that's how we've gotten where we are. We specialize in one thing, and then commerce takes that specialization and ramps it up to large scale to make high profits. So now we have vulnerable countries, which are usually smaller, less industrialized, still needing to go and do development, but our commerce society will want to come in and do large scale development, which is often harmful for the environment. So in my position, in my outlook, we need to look towards small scale specific needs for these areas that are in community of different types of projects. Because even solar is bad on large scale. Even wind is bad on large scale. We need to start doing smaller, move away from that specialization and do smaller scale projects across the earth in multiple communities. And I was just wondering, how will that combination of forcing corporations away from large-scale specialization, forcing governments away from only funding those large-scale corporations that they're used to dealing with and contracting with, and also protecting the environment through small-scale projects that are specific to areas. It's like a very nasty little bed of things, isn't it?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. I have two more hands here. Please go ahead. If you can introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. I'm Denise Fontanilla from the Philippines. I wanted to ask, this is related to the question earlier from SEI. What do our panelists think about loss and damage, the establishment of the loss and damage facility as a make or break issue? Should there be a differentiation, for example, of demanding in the immediate term funding versus the long-term mission of putting up a facility? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, couple here. Please go ahead and then please.
All right. All of you in the panel actually mentioned. Sorry, my name is Veena and I'm with the Climate Youth Negotiator Program. So all of you in the panel mentioned about diversifying equity and justice, and also about the role of youth. And my question is very specific to that. Christopher, you had a great example of how the young people in the country actually brought about a change more institutionally. So how do you think young people could contribute to these negotiations, the climate change negotiations that are happening over here? How do you think they can feed into the system? Because this is also one of the places where the decisions are being made. Would love to hear all of your thoughts. Thanks.
Hello. Hi, I'm Nusrat. I'm working in the International Center for Climate Change and Development. So my question was kind of specific that, earlier we have agreed on a 100 billion pledge for mitigation and adaptation. So I just wanted to know how that came into play. And if that could happen, then why can't we have a similar kind of new and additional finance, agreement for loss and damage? And, what will it take for that to happen? And if it has historically happened, then why can't that happen now? I mean, we'll of course work out on the nitty-gritty aspects of it, but why just not have the pledge at hand? Thank you.
I think that was a referral to the political will at that time to do it, which has certainly disappeared since then. Let's see if we can recreate it. Any last questions from the floor? And then I'll come to the panelists and give each of them an opportunity to answer questions and also make some last final comments. I see one more hand there. Shall we take that, and then we'll come across here?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Titi Akusa. I work with Center for 21st Century Issues, based in Nigeria. Yeah, my question is really basically around the promotion of insurance as a kind of a solution to loss and damage. I've been wondering whether it's insurance actually part of the solution, or should we also not look at insurance itself entirely? And then the role of the private sector in loss and damage finance, it has not been very, very clear to me how they're going to bring it in. And then again, when we're looking at the loss and damage finance facility, we all have agreed that it has not been very, very easy for local people who are on the front lines of climate change to access climate finance. And access is just one thing. Even getting the finance itself, it's also another thing. So for us, how will a loss and damage facility be better than all the climate funds and finances that we have in such a way that climate finance will get to those who need it at the right time? That's if eventually we actually get the loss and damage finance facility. Thank you.
Excellent set of questions. So let me now invite our panelists. I'll go in reverse order with Preeti first and then to my left. Feel free to answer any of the questions you feel you'd like to address, and also some concluding remarks from your side as well.
Sure. I'll start with the question Zoa from SEI asked. It's a complicated one. It's a complicated one whether we want to be pragmatic in terms of getting financing flowing, or whether we want to bring that issue of principles and morals and responsibility to the fore. I think in terms of the latter, there is a recognition, and that's why there is the fear. So if it was about making a point, the point has been made. And if we want to be pragmatic and move on, then it is a question of we are parking that issue. We are not ignoring it. We are parking that issue, but now let's move on to how we will address it. So in that context, I think, and Christopher, you can correct me if I'm wrong, from the developing country negotiators, they've moved beyond that compensation and reparation issue. Now it is the developed countries which are bringing it up. We don't know whether it is as an excuse or is it a real fear, but that real fear was, I thought, set to bed with relevant provisions in the decision that was taken. It was not part of the of the Paris Agreement, but it was part of the cover decision that we're not talking about compensation over here. So I think we have to remind them that, we have recognized that and we want to move on, and we want you to move on with us. So I would address it like that, and I think maybe the developing country negotiators have to talk loudly about it also, so that that issue is then put to the side and does not confuse the matters at hand. So that's an important question, but that is a question about communication as well. The second question that I'd really like to take is the role of the youth. And I mean, we have seen that revolution. We have seen that revolution. You are being represented everywhere in all the halls over here. But what I can tell you is from my time at the Secretariat, if you didn't indulge me, at that point in time, we had actually recognized that, and we had set up an intergenerational inquiry kind of a program. Yeah, so it was at that point in time we used to get, it was at each of the SBs, we used to get the youth delegates, the youngers, to come and talk to some of the negotiators and ask those difficult questions, that you're talking about our future. It's not about here and now. It is about what you will face, how your lives and lifestyles would be constrained, and your opportunities as well. And that used to bring in that sense of realism. I don't know whether it's still continuing or not. It is excellent. So, you are the future. You are the ones who will give us the new ideas also. It's not gray-haired people like us. We've done whatever we could. We've done our bit. It's up to you. And the way you have brought it forth in the last few years, hats off to all of you, really admire it. And don't let people who say, that the young people, they do not understand the politics of it or whatever, do not let that faze you. You just continue to raise your voice, continue to talk about, what you're looking for, what your vision of the future is. It may not be materialistic like the world we have lived in, and call us out. Call the older generation out and say, this is not done. And you're doing it with your parents. I know that. You're doing it with your parents, the way you're changing your lifestyles, the way many of you are going vegetarian, and you have, it rests with you. It is not shifting the role of our generation. It is a question of you precipitating change. And you're doing an excellent job of it, if I may say so. And my last thing is on the 100 billion. I think a story could be written about it. I can tell you.
Whoever thought of that figure?
I can tell you at one point in time in Copenhagen, the number was also 500 billion. It was that push and pull that brought it to 100 billion. That's what people could live with. So that's what was cast into stone, and look where we are with the 100 billion as well. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
And that's more than 10 years ago, remember. Good. Chucks.
Thank you. Let me take the question on insurance. The answer is a very good question. For me, the answer is that there is no silver bullet out there. What we found in the IPCC report is that ideally you want to have all the instruments. However, all of the instruments could actually be dangerous if it is not well planned and sensitive to the local context. We have the emission trading scheme, which some people like to bash, and sometimes for good reasons. But the emission trading has worked in some jurisdictions, but has also rewarded polluters in some other jurisdictions because it's been badly designed. The carbon tax has worked in some jurisdictions, but also haven't worked quite well in other jurisdictions where it has again been badly designed. Feed-in tariff is held in some countries, but it's been criticized in other countries. The issue is not necessarily with insurance, but if you design an insurance mechanism that ends up taxing the poor in order to tackle the problem, then surely you have exacerbated the problem. And this is also well articulated in IPCC Report 2, where a range of different maladaptation mechanisms have been raised. And this links to the point that the lady from the US made. Big energy systems themselves are not necessarily the problem. The big problem is that we don't have good procedural justice in making energy decisions. We often cite solar panel, solar farm projects in communities without asking the communities what is their view about siting these solar panel projects here, without enough cost-benefit analysis about the implication of that project to food security or water security or other kinds of community cohesion. So this brings again the issue of procedural justice in energy planning and due and thorough environmental and social impact assessment. In Nigeria, for example, we have been pushing for greater transparency and enlargement of the social and environmental impact assessment, especially related to extractive industries. We don't have that. And as a result, local communities, especially in the Niger Delta region, continue to suffer untold hardship, environmental pollution for the extraction of oil in that country. So there's a need for equity. And maybe to create some tension in the panel, I would now like to disagree with Salim and Priti to say or to remind us that when developing countries moved away from compensation and reparation, it was so that there could be progress. Not that, in my view, there is no intellectual argument for compensation and reparation. And the problem it creates when we say, okay, now let's not talk about reparation or compensation, is that you then lose the justice argument. It now becomes, okay, just help me, on the basis of, help or solidarity. For me, I think that justice is a fundamental virtue to which rich countries subscribe to, and which we cannot just do away with. We've already done away with it largely. First of all, of course, we say we cannot make progress. Well, everything has to be on the basis of common but differential responsibility principle, and somebody that subscribes to fairness in his own country says, if equity is in, I am out. You remember that phrase? So, and then eventually equity was removed, and still they moved away from that regime after the whole world had bent over backwards to accommodate their demand to expunge equity. Now, people said to me many years ago, this Kyoto Protocol is nonsensical, it can never work, this top-down target is, it's not consistent with the logic of international relations. We said, okay, what do you want? Let's just do voluntary pledges and then bottom up. That's what we've done. Yeah. Look at where we are with it. The emission is rising every year. So, and tomorrow in Sharm el-Sheikh, you will see some people pull again numbers. But emission may continue to rise. So how do we square these, pledges and rhetorics with the real push? So one of the ways that the youth can push is to begin to go back to the idea of some kind of stick, sanction of a sort, target of a sort. If you're not keeping your promise, what is the consequence of that? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Christopher, top that.
Can't be done, cannot be done. No, I want to talk about the spaces that we're in and the narratives that we use. And I think in this particular space, we need to use the narrative of solidarity. There are other spaces. Vanuatu is bringing, the issue now to the International Court of Justice, where there may be avenues to some of these discussions. First, here, I think we need to address very clearly that there is a gap in finance for loss and damage. And if we all sing from that song sheet, then we are going to move. The science confirms it, the technical analysis confirms it, and now we're getting the political signals. Thank you to the government of Scotland. Thank you to the Walloonian government. I've even heard the Canadian government talk about finance for loss and damage. G77, we are now at the moment where we can make this happen. We're clear that we need a finance facility for loss and damage. What that means, we'll work together to figure that out. Vanuatu also made a political signal. I don't know if you heard, on the 27th of May, the parliament unanimously declared a climate emergency, and this was not saber rattling. What we did is we said, we are going to submit an NDC this year, according to the Glasgow Pact, which puts the issue of loss and damage at the front of the NDC for Vanuatu. If every country did that, imagine where we would be right now. So we've got 12 new targets. We've costed out our NDC. It's going to cost $1.2 billion US. Now we're going to have to figure out where we source that funding, but at least we've made it clear that that's what it costs, and this is what we want to invest it in. So it's no longer scary. It's not about compensation or loss and damage. This is now where we want to invest that money. Finally, I want to say that we need now an agenda item for this issue, whether it's here at SBs, which we absolutely hope that it will be, most definitely a COP, so that we finally now make decision space in this collective process for loss and damage. Vanuatu's ready, Vanuatu's committed, and we're hoping that other parties will step up with us to address this issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I could, I'd like to touch on a paper that was released by the V20 earlier this week. One is that climate change has eliminated 1/5 of the wealth over the last 2 decades. That means V20 would have been 20% richer in the last 2 decades. And for the top 10% of the most vulnerable economies in the V20, climate change removed 51% of all growth. So these are major numbers that are already being paid for by economies and communities across the climate vulnerable countries. So in terms of the facility, I heard it a lot in the hallways. I think we need to be consistent. We cannot call for a facility to be set up as the ultimate solution at the same time we say act now. So communities need resources now, as in now, because they are in relentless pain, and they've been dealing with this for the last 2 decades. It is in the real economy where things count and communities need resources to deal with the unimaginable impacts that they are reeling from. And so I think northern CSOs here today need to start making their governments move to be accountable and to make various funds that are already in place add loss and damage as an actual tool or an actual item that they decide to resource today. And then in terms of the issue of insurance, I agree, and the design's really important. The context is really important. But I think when you're talking about tools, you don't come in with the tool, you come in with the issue, and then you design the tool to deal with the issue. The insurance and reinsurance industry have extensive modeling expertise and data, which means we can run cost-benefit analysis to understand what makes the most sense considering financial constraints or what needs to be subsidized. The V20 has a premium subsidy facility under KFW. Why? Because insurance is expensive up front and we don't have market scale. And so until such time, we need premium subsidies. So there are, options, tools on the table already, but this isn't the starting point. This is something that we work towards. And then I guess as a final note, the financial protection gap across the V20 is 98%. This is massive, and so we need to act quickly with haste, and we have expertise that we can leverage. It's about coordinating this expertise, and I think the V20 is also contributing to the work on the global shield that the G7 has put forward, and so this is something we hope can leverage these experiences and ensure that communities can get resourcing quicker and sooner. I think that's most of the questions.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to all the panelists for an excellent set of ideas and comments and recommendations. I'm not going to try and summarize, but I will pick up a few messages that I heard and expand on them and take them forward. Firstly, on finance, the situation now, more than a decade since the 100 billion figure appeared on our consciousness, is in the trillions. Okay, the 100 billion is a trivial amount now. But the other aspect of the trillions is that it isn't trillions of climate finance anymore. It's just trillions of dollars and euros and pounds that are being spent on development issues be better spent, be climate-friendly spent, whether it's loss and damage, whether it's mitigation, whether it's adaptation. It spreads across everything that we do. So it's about trillions, but not as siloed climate finance anymore. That really is something we need to think about as we go forward, and in particular, something for finance ministers in particular to be the ones to think about. And as has already been rightly said, it's not environment ministers who are in charge anymore. It's finance ministers who have the money and who need to be rethinking how to use that money. The other issue that came up, particularly in the context of global goal and adaptation, that Chooks made a very strong case for a IPCC special report to provide us guidance. I certainly support that. I would also add to that a possible IPCC special report on loss and damage as well, which is a fairly new subject, which, there's a lot of science that still needs to be done, a lot of understanding to be gained by doing that. Special reports of IPCC can be done quite quickly if the IPCC decides in the 7th assessment round to do them. A couple of years for a special report is certainly doable, and they will be within the time period that we would require to make a decision on. So that would be something worth pushing for and getting countries to push for. And then on the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage in particular, we need to be thinking of making this a fruitful dialogue and not a unfruitful dialogue like we had the last time. This is, by the way, the second time we're having a dialogue. We had something called the Suva dialogue a few years ago, which didn't lead to very much except insurance. And so hopefully this time we'll learn that lesson and we'll move it forward. And in particular, in the sense of solidarity and developed and developing countries both having to face impacts of climate change, having to pay for losses and damages, and seeing ways in which we can help each other develop our abilities to do them more effectively. So hopefully that will sort of thread through the arguments and discussions that take place into Sharm el-Sheikh. And then the final point on youth, I endorse what Preeti has said, and also feel that we need to be empowering the youth to a much greater extent than we have already. And I was at an event, I think yesterday or day before, in fact, in the same room where I made a statement, which I'm going to repeat, which is that we need to no longer regard our leaders as our bosses, but as our younger generation, as our bosses. And you, the younger generation, have to act as our bosses. You need to be telling us what we have to do and not listening to us because we did everything wrong, all right? And you know that, and we know that, and you need to be telling us how to do it right. Thank you.
Yeah.